Hello, welcome to Lachlan Likes a Thing, the show where I take a thing and see whether or not I like it. Now, this month I am leaning into the earphones a little bit more because this month I intend on making a sort of comparison roundup with a lot of the earphones in my collection, and that's been long overdue. And as part of that, I thought it would be important for me to compare the LS50, which I recently bought, with the ATH-E40, both from Audio Technica. And I thought it was important to compare the two because they're the latest offerings from Audio Technica, and they're, at the time that I'm making this video, around the same price on Amazon in the US and in Australian retail. So I bought the E40 with some of this month's Patreon contributions, and thank you so much to everyone who chipped in for that. I am totally intending to get the LS200iS. I know that won the recent poll that I ran in terms of viewer interest, but recently I had a look at the Japanese pricing on Amazon JP for the LS200, and it's about half the price it is at Australian retail. So, you know, I want to support Australian businesses. I particularly want to support Australian brick and mortar stores where you can go in and demo earphones, but it's a bit unreasonable when the Japanese street price of the same product is half the price it is in Australia. So I just want to see how that pans out. I'm still making a decision on that, but yeah, I may have to go and get it forwarded through Tenso or something like that. On a side note, actually, I had a bit of a grumble about the LS200 pricing on Twitter, and Audio Technica Australia actually responded to my tweet on a Saturday. So a big props to whoever's manning the social media accounts over there. I hope they're not keeping you locked in a closet with a laptop on the weekend. So let's get back to the subject at hand, which is a comparison of the LS50 with the E40. Because you may be wondering why, you know, they cost around the same amount, but why would you have two products at around the same price point that seem kind of similar? Well, these are actually part of two different lines from Audio Technica. The LS50 is part of the consumer line. LS might actually stand for lifestyle. That's just a wild guess on my part. But it is a kind of general consumer earphone. You can tell because it's got this kind of stylish, fashion-forward gloss black shell here with a 1.2 meter detachable cable with a smartphone remote. Whereas the E40, you can tell it's a different kind of beast entirely. The E40 is part of Audio Technica's professional monitoring line, and so it's intended to be used by musicians as either a mixing monitor or a stage monitor. So a monitor for mixing is what you listen to, what you listen through while you're producing a track, when you're adjusting levels or EQ or that kind of thing, and you want a more accurate representation of the tone. The E40 is also billed as a stage monitor, and a stage monitor is what a musician wears when they're up on stage performing live and they need to be able to hear their own instruments or their own vocals above sort of like what's happening in the performance. So they wear these, generally they run the cable down their back into a wireless receiver or something like that. And I honestly think that the E40 is probably designed more for use as a stage monitor. And the reason why I say this is because, number one, the isolation, the housing of this earphone has been designed for maximum isolation. And you can see that it's physically larger than the LS50 housing. And it's substantially large. This black part here in particular, this occupies most of the outer ear. And I honestly think that someone at Audio Technica must have some perverse fascination with really stretching the frontiers of human ear geometry, because this is a big earphone, and it's not even the biggest earphone that Audio-Technica makes these days. I've got to say, in terms of comfort, the LS50 is all right. It's lightweight, and this kind of sharp angle here is not as bad as it looks. I generally find that the LS50 is pretty comfortable for long wear, though I do find that after about 2 hours, and I've used this for sort of voice chats on Discord, the housing can rub the wrong way in your ear. That's something to watch out for. The E40, I would be really hesitant to buy this earphone without a good return policy or without trying it first, because it is so substantially large. I actually don't have a problem with this earphone in terms of the housing shape fitting in my outer ear. What I do find though is that this nozzle, which is very thick, you can see it's quite a thick nozzle that reaches into the ears. There is part of this nozzle which is rubbing against part of my inside ear on my left ear, and it's a little bit irritating, but it might just be that I was fiddling around too much on the day one wear. So we'll see how that goes, and I'll report back on that in terms of long-term use and comfort. I will say that the isolation on this earphone is really, really good. Like, I was wearing it in the city yesterday, Sydney CBD, could not hear a thing above the music I was listening to. And the LS50, you know, is not terrible in terms of isolation. It's decent. It's not ported or anything like that. But the E40, just really good isolation, the same way that the E70 has isolation. And you sort of pay for that with this very large housing, I believe. The other thing I'll note is that the LS50 comes with sort of like a flimsy pouch, which isn't particularly inspiring. I haven't even used it. Whereas the E40 comes with a proper hard case, which is something you might want to factor into the price. Now, when I say that the E40 is sort of designed more for professional use, this doesn't preclude it from general consumer use, because what's good enough for a professional musician is generally good enough, more than good enough for a general consumer. But there are some caveats to that, and I'll break that down for you. So first things first, you may have noticed, if you have an eye for these things, that these are not the stock silicone ear tips that come with these earphones. These are the stock ones here. And I think that they're basically the same for the E40 and the LS50. The LS50 one is slightly shinier black, but you know, TMI, but this might just be earwax that's causing that difference in coloration. But they have approximately the same aperture or opening, as you can see. And the tips that I've fitted on these earphones are different. So on the LS50, I went with spin fits, which are kind of rotate, and the nozzle and the aperture is it's about the same amount, but I generally find that these spin fits bring out more high frequency treble. Whereas the E40s I'm using with these fake Sony hybrids that I have a bag of. Honestly, and if you can leave a comment if you know where I might have bought these, because I have forgotten where I bought these. I have a Ziploc bag full of these fake Sony hybrids. I want to order some more. And I would like to tell people where I ordered them from, but I cannot work it out. They're sort of like the V-Sonic aftermarket tips, the Sony hybrid imitations, and they're fake because they're designed like the same way that the Sony hybrid tips are designed, with a stiffer inner core of silicon and then a more flexible outer black silicon part, though the fake ones are a little stiffer than the real ones, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Anyway, the aperture on the Sony hybrids is a little narrower, and that helps, I find, suppress some of the mids and high frequencies. So that little tip rolling exercise is going to give you some clue about what I think are the differences in sound between these two earphones. Again, if you're familiar with this sort of thing, you can probably guess what my comments are going to be. But the LS50 is much of a bassier, warmer sounding earphone than the E40. It's got much more of an emphasis in the lower mids. It still has a bit of nice Audio-Technica coloration or sort of a lift in the upper vocals or the upper mid-range, so that female vocals can sound quite nice and textured, and it sounds, I think, cleaner in that region than something like the Shure SE215. However, overall, at times, just like the SE215, the LS50 can sound a bit muffled, a bit loose, particularly in the bass. And for most tracks, it's a really enjoyable, easy listen. And I still stand by my earlier comments. On some tracks, it just sounds really nice and easy to listen to. But on other tracks, it can sometimes just fall apart. So an example of a track where the LS50 kind of falls apart is Lose Yourself to Dance from Daft Punk's Random Access Memories. If you listen to that track on the LS50, the bass line on that track, which is a really big bass line on that track, it's unusually big, I have to say, it sounds terrible on the LS50. It just becomes so bloated and just kind of loose. It's really almost nauseating. And that's really unfortunate. That's been my experience now over time with the LS50 after listening for quite some time. It's really nice. I like the earphone right up until I come upon a really bassy track, and then it just sounds yuck. It's sort of unfortunate. It's my biggest problem by far with this earphone. With the E40, it's sort of the exact opposite situation. Not quite exactly opposite, but it's strong in areas where the LS50 is weak. For instance, the bass on this earphone is so nice. It's so tight. It's it's really nice sub bass extension with just a little bit, not too much of the emphasis. So everything has a nice solidity to it. In terms of the mid frequencies, though, this earphone is, as Gordon Ramsay would say, it's raw. It's really, really kind of forward in the lower mids, or sort of the upper mid section, not necessarily high frequencies. It doesn't have that kind of S-sibilance hiss kind of emphasis in the same way that something like the VSonic VSD5S or the Sony XBA-Z5 has. It doesn't have a problem there. It has it in the lower frequencies with sort of with brass instruments, saxophones, that sort of thing. It can sound really sort of abrasive. A track where this really stands out is the track Arrest Yourself from Hot Chip from their album The Warning. This is a fun track, and it's actually mastered in such a way that it's almost difficult to listen to on a lot of equipment, but on the E40 with the stock tips, it just tears your ears apart because of that kind of square wave buzzing that just rips through the mids, and it sounds really painful. When it's not one of those tracks, it sounds clean and aggressive and forward. I mentioned in earlier videos that it sounds a bit like an Audio-Technica M50X. Upon longer listen, it's sort of similar, but not quite. I think it's a little flatter or a little more natural than the M50X. It doesn't have that kind of deep V, so you don't get a very kind of shrill metallic sound coupled with a sort of bass emphasis. But it does have some of those qualities. I have to say though, as soon as I put these fake Sony hybrid tips on, I have fallen in love with this earphone. It sounds fantastic with the fake Sony hybrid tips, because the Sony hybrid tips, they suppress some of the lower mid rawness of this earphone. They make the sound a little less clean. They compress the sound a little bit more. So, in terms of sheer detail, you do lose some of that clarity. At the same time, though, with the Sony hybrid tips, it really helps moderate the earphone, and then what you're left with is something with a nice sense of scale in terms of the bass, a nice solid sound, still a lot of clarity in the mid frequencies without being harsh in the high frequencies with the treble. And as a result, it just sounds really fun and nice to listen to. And I would say that with these tips, it is easily in the top tier of my recommendations for electronic music. I don't know if it beats my favorites for electronic, like the Sony XBA-Z5 and the Yamaha EPH-100, but it does belong in the same tier with these tips. It's really quite nice. So with both of these earphones, it's kind of funny. I recommend them with sort of caveats. With the LS50, I think it's a well-priced earphone that's nice and easy to listen to, but it can really fall apart with some basic tracks, and I would recommend, I don't even think that the LS70 does a much better job in those terms. If you're sort of deciding between the LS50 and the LS70, I say get the LS50 and then spend the price difference on the SpinFit tips, because they will clean up the sound a little bit more on the LS50, and there's not that much of a big jump up to the LS70. And frankly, I found that the LS70 had a bit more bass, which I did not want. So that's why that's sort of my recommendation with the LS50. With the E40, hesitate on other dimensions. Number one, don't get this earphone if you are unsure it will fit in your ears, because it is a sort of borderline case here. And by all means, I would buy it if you can get a good return policy. Don't know how different regions vary in terms of hygiene laws for this sort of thing, but get it with a return policy, or get it after you've tried it, because it is not necessarily going to be comfortable in smaller ears. Also, you may find that the mid frequencies are a little bit abrasive if you don't do a little bit of tip rolling. But once you find the magic tip, I reckon these sound fantastic. So I will be sort of including this earphone in my roundup of, I think, great earphones, around $100, $200. So I hope that helps you out if you sort of were interested in the differences between these two earphones. Thanks again to everyone who contributed towards this purchase. Really helps me out. If you want to help out, you can hop on over to patreon.com/LachlanLikesAthing. There's a link in the description. And, it's what makes this sort of thing possible. So thanks again, and happy listening.